The Agronomist is brought to you by the Wheat School, RealAg Radio, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, ADAMA is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Hi, everyone. Welcome here. I am Lyndsey Smith, your host. This is The Agronomists, and I am super excited for tonight's chat. We are going to talk about nitrogen management of wheat, but before we get there, we have a few housekeeping items, one of which is that tonight's show does qualify for a knowledge sharing event. We got that just at the end of today, so in case you missed that, so if you do have those of you in Ontario, if you've got a project that you need a knowledge sharing event for, this one will work. So later in the show, I'll be giving you an email address to send a note to get that all squared away. Also, if you can believe it, next Monday is the holiday Monday. It is Labor Day. And so there will not be a show next week, but tune in September 11th. We're going to be talking about fall weed control. And of course, if you collect those CEU credits every week, you can head to realagriculture.com/agronomists to collect those CEU credits for this episode. I am super pumped. Let's bring in tonight's guests. Yes, it is Peter Wheat Pete Johnson and Brunel Sabourin out of Manitoba. Brunel, let's see if you can hear us. Hi, we can hear you. This is amazing. So Brunel was a last minute hop on because we couldn't quite get going. So I am so glad to see you. Welcome here.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about the delay.
That's all right. We're here. Peter, how are you?
I am awesome, thank Lyndsey. Of course, I'm always awesome when I'm on The Agronomist. It's just a fun place to be.
It is. All right, well, let's start with, I see Jason is here, finally sunny and warm in Manitoba, where Brunel is at. Patrick's on. Hi, Patrick. And Jim says heat's on its way to Ontario to reduce some of those drying bills. Jim, we're talking about wheat. We're not talking about corn. No, just kidding. We can talk about corn. Pete, let's start just quickly, a quick update on where we're at. We are sort of in that lull. Wheat's off, waiting on beans and corn, and maybe getting a wheat crop in the ground very soon. How are things looking out your way?
Oh, Lyndsey, we're not in a lull at all. Are we ever in a lull in agriculture? Yes. So first off, we did Bern and I did a nice little video today that'll hopefully be up in a couple of days on broadcasting wheat into soybeans, standing soybeans. So there's already people that are looking to get that job done. So wheat seeding is almost underway. And I saw my first sprayer today out desiccating cranberry beans, early seeded cranberry beans. So harvest is just, a week or less away from that standpoint. The corn crop might be late, and it might be a lull in the sheep industry, in the woolly pig industry, but it ain't a lull here for the rest of us.
Yeah. Pasture lice. All right. And Brunel, so Jason did say finally some sunny and warm temps. How are things out your way in Southern Manitoba?
Oh, we've got warm, sunny weather now finally. Last week was a little kind of spotty rain showers and very humid. So harvest had kind of got going about a week and a half ago. But a lot of guys were still waiting on just some late tillers and some late emerging. We had emergence problems this year with the dry conditions. But this extra week now, everybody, the last 2 days, I think they're going to get hard at her, and we're going to knock off some big cereal acres for sure. And it should follow into canola. And there's soybean fields we're probably 2 weeks ahead on some soybean fields. So it's going to be an early harvest for the most part, and as long as the weather keeps cooperating.
That's right. We need Mother Nature to cooperate. Pete, you roll your eyes at waiting on tillers. Why?
Oh, it's those late tillers just drive everybody nuts, and it just always seems to happen. And clearly, Brunel, you must have had something early in the season that released those late tillers, and now they're holding up harvest. But you guys are in a different situation than we are here in Eastern Canada. You're 2 weeks ahead, and our corn crop is 2 weeks behind. So you just how you could get that kind of a spread, but it's just where we're at this year.
Yeah. Well, Brunel, I talked to farmers last week on the Rapid Fire and out of Manitoba that the soybeans do seem to be perhaps ahead, of where they normally would be.
Yeah, for sure. Looking at some calculators and looking at growing degree days, when we look at the long-term average, we're a full 2 weeks ahead on some fields. Like these would be early seeded May soybeans, 00.7 maturity ratings. So yeah, the pods are full to the top and their time is done. We've had tremendous heat, like right from the get-go. It seems like we skipped spring here. We went straight from winter to 30 plus degree days, which unfortunately doesn't usually translate into a big wheat crop. And that's what we're seeing right now. But
Yeah.
there are some exceptions to every rule and there are some surprises. So,
yep. We'll take our wins when we can, right, Pete?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of funny because our soybeans are not very far behind. Our corn is way behind. We're about 6 days behind on crop heat unit on accumulation, and the
Yeah.
corn is further behind than 6 days by quite a bit. And you kind of go, why is that? And yet you look at the soybean crop, you look at the edible bean crop, and they're pretty close to normal, which is kind of intriguing, because you would then say, well, it's because the soybeans and the edible beans, they're day length sensitive and the corn is heat sensitive. But Brunel's saying the exact opposite. He's saying it was hot and that heat drove the soybeans early. So clearly the soybeans are both the day length and heat sensitive. And yeah, you should have.
Winning.
It always hurts me when you tell me you don't have a big wheat crop, Brunel, but at least with high temperatures, if you got enough moisture, the soybean crop should just be excellent, because soybeans love heat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do have one customer that had all the right rain. So despite the heat early on, like we weren't expecting it, but we were able to pull almost 100 bushels off of one field. Now, unfortunately, that's the exception, not the norm this year, but a lot of guys it's still not a high yielding crop, but we're kind of surprised that in most cases what we are getting despite the conditions.
Mm-hmm. I would like to just state for the record, however, that all this lovely rosy talk about soybeans doesn't make my heart flutter at all. I do not like soybeans, and everybody should know this by now. So anyway, I'm glad for you. If you're a farmer who's got a great soybean crop, I'm happy for you, but bleh. Anyway, I guess whatever. They're good for rotation, so that's fine. Okay, we're going to switch gears, though. It's great to know sort of where we're at. Of course, we are rounding out August here, which feels a little bit bizarre. I'll be honest. I feel like August disintegrated, just poof, gone in a flash. So here we are heading into the fall. So, and we talk about this at Real Agriculture when we're doing something like the wheat school and we're planning it. We talk about that really we have two wheat crops, right? We have our fall seeded Ontario winter wheat crop, and then we have, for the most part, a spring crop in the West. Yes, the West has some fall seeded, and yes, Ontario has some spring seeded, but that's usually how things fall. So yes, we have two crops, but there are a lot of similarities, and then there are some key differences. And so tonight I want to unpack some of those. And so I open it up, of course, to everyone in the comments as well. If you've got your questions about either winter wheat or spring wheat, they're all welcome here. And we're going to talk specifically nitrogen management. There are some other things that are going to play a role in here too. Brunel, I'm going to start out west, largely a spring crop. Are we still seeing most of the N up front? And if so, are we talking fall applied? Or how has that maybe changed?
I think it's more of a mix, depending on the conditions. In the Red River Valley where I am, we're still largely a fall applied crop as long as we've got a nice open fall to do it. Generally, some of it is economics as much as it is agronomics. We are doing research just to see, as it's still truth to the fact that we're better, all the research says that we're better off, more efficient spring applied nitrogen, but like we said, there's always exceptions to every rules, but we are seeing more and more, like as the prices of fertilizer climb and the price of commodities, we're seeing a lot more producers wanting to look at that. Okay, now does it pay to top dress? Does it pay to variable rate? Does it pay? Like the economics have completely changed the game again from what it was even 10 years ago. So we're seeing a lot more farmers open to the idea of putting down a base rate, whether it's in the fall or the spring ahead of seeding, to make sure that we have our bases covered, but then managing our risk by leaving a bit of a window open that we can adjust our nitrogen once we see how the crop comes out of the ground. And, that first month and a half, we see what kind of crop we're facing. And because we're on a floodplain here too, they're I think that's where our advantage is to variable rating some nitrogen is we don't know if it's going to be our ridges versus our depressions that are going to be yielding depending on the weather. This year tends to be the depressions that are higher yielding because we didn't get rain, but on a wet year, it's complete opposite.
The opposite.
Like we're talking 3 feet difference in elevation on the mile in some cases. That's for us, that's lots.
That's huge for now. Huge. Yeah. Pete, don't make fun. All right. Yeah. It's a valley. It's flat. Leave it alone. Okay.
I can have 30 feet difference in elevation in I don't know 200 feet or whatever. Yes. So 3 feet in a mile.
Yeah. Growing up when I went out west to Alberta, I said, "What do they mean Saskatchewan's flat?"
Mm-hmm. Hey, Brunel, so I have a question, if I could. So what's your base rate in the fall? You said growers are going towards more of a base rate in the fall, and I love it. Give yourself some management opportunity in the spring because wheat responds to management, and if you put all the nitrogen on in the fall, you've spent all your money. And then if you get the super wet spring, you may well lose some of that nitrogen. And like there's all those different things. So what is the percentage of the nitrogen put on in the fall? Are you looking at half? Are you looking at 3/4? What's the base rate?
I think we're looking higher than half just because the falls can be, or the spring, sorry, can be such a big question mark. So I like to see at least 75 to 80% of our nitrogen needs up front ahead of putting the crop in the ground, because we're on heavy clay soils, we're always running the risk of, if it's too wet, number one, we can't get in to top dress on a timely fashion, or if it gets to be later in the season, we have such a short growing window that we don't have time to make adjustments. So we need that rain later to get the fertilizer in the ground. Like if we're looking at that 6-7 leaf stage as the time that we're going to top dress. So to me, having at least 75 or 80% of your nitrogen needs up front is a better risk management than trying to go half and then relying on being able to get a 60 pounds or so on later. Normally, we're targeting anywhere from low end 120 to on the high end 150 pounds of available nitrogen between what was on the soil test and what we're applying as fertilizer. We do have a lot of denitrification here too because of the heavy clay soils and the rain. So we tend to be higher nitrogen, or we're putting on more nitrogen than other areas for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and even Western Canada is kind of an interesting conundrum because you're in the Red River Valley, which gets quite a bit of rain, and you still worry about the spring because of denitrification and flooding and timing and all those things. But if you're in the Pallets or Triangle, if you're,
for sure.
Like it's different there because putting nitrogen on in the spring there, the real risk is that it sits on the surface and never gets a rainfall. And so it's sort of a real balancing act between how that can come together. Meanwhile, for you guys, you get too much rain and you get more nitrogen loss, then that's not where you want to be either. You'd rather actually put that on in the spring, even if it's a bit later, probably, as long as it got in the ground, just because we don't want to, cause that environmental concern or that economic loss. Really cool. And I'm really waiting, Lyndsey. I don't know if other listeners have been following Daniel Konopelski, I think it is, from Saskatchewan. He had the winter wheat planted in September and the hard red spring planted October the 31st.
Right. Yes.
And so his winter wheat yielded 58 bushels per acre on, I think he said 58 or 68 millimeters of rainfall. And his dormant seeded spring wheat, like he was just waiting on the weather to harvest it, but it was way better than anything he seeded in the spring because he was too wet in the spring and couldn't get it in timely. So just lots of things to think about as we go down this road.
That Pete, that's like not even ultra early seeding. That's like ultra early seeding of taking a spring variety, putting it into cold ground, putting it into cold storage over the winter, and then letting it'll do its thing as soon as possible. So you're right, Pete. We need to follow along because it's a fascinating sort of thought process, but someone's actually out there doing it. So we need to keep tabs on that as well. I'm also going to point out here, because I haven't seen Jim Hale on the chat, but he usually will point out it doesn't matter what you do if it doesn't rain. So I feel like I need to state that. So I'm going to do that for Farmer Jim out of Lancer, Saskatchewan. It hasn't rained in a while. And Kara would like to know that she would prefer you not to call the West a conundrum, Pete. It hurts her feelings. Okay. All right. So carrying on, we've already, though, identified several of the things that we do have to take into consideration, which, yes, is timing, but also is the conditions that you're dealing with and trying to manage that risk against what is more likely to happen in your area on your soil, right? So is the higher risk you can't get on, or and you need it there up front, or is the higher risk that you're going to lose it and putting it on ahead is going to end up just costing you? Now, Pete, when we're looking at Ontario's wheat crop, we're mostly talking about a fall seeded crop. You don't want to see N in the fall. And why is that? Let's just get that one out of the way.
So our wheat doesn't grow through the winter. And Shane and I did a number of trials about fall applied nitrogen. When ESN first came out, the thought process was, well, we could put some ESN on in the fall, and that would get us away from having to try to get out early in the spring when it's too wet to run or whatever. At the end of the day, Lyndsey, it just doesn't work. Any nitrogen we put on in the fall, 50% of it was a loss. And so if we put on 50 pounds of nitrogen in the fall, we could do the exact same thing with 25 pounds of nitrogen in the spring. And fall nitrogen never increased yield. Why would I spend money on nitrogen that never increases yield? So fall nitrogen under Ontario conditions just doesn't work. If you're in the UK, if you're in New Zealand, because there the winters are warmer and the crop grows and tillers almost all winter, that's a totally different story. So they talk about, 30 or 50 pounds of fall nitrogen because they want to support those 8, 9, 10 tillers per plant, or at least 5 tillers per plant. Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, really just doesn't make any sense. And it's an environmental concern. So why would we, number one, throw money away, not get any more yield, and harm the environment? Like that's 3 strikes, you're out. Fall nitrogen doesn't work in the Great Lakes Basin.
Mm-hmm. So, and then to sort of contrast that with where Brunel is in Manitoba, and actually Dr. Dave is reading my mind, which is perhaps terrifying. Sorry about your luck there. But if in Ontario, we consider that we could be losing 50% of that, and what would the estimate be for the Red River Valley, Brunel? So if you're putting on that 75, 80% base rate in the fall, what sort of risk of loss do you sort of consider is there? What have you seen as evidence of what's still there in the spring?
This isn't replicated, or it's more anecdotal, I guess, but through 25 years of experience consulting in the valley, if we get early water, I guess I'm thinking flood, which isn't really the scenario, but if we get an early spring thaw, generally we're pretty good. If we get a late season flood where we've got water sitting on the fields in late April, early May, then that's where we tend to lose a lot of nitrogen to denitrification. We don't have any kind of leaching, like especially where I am, we're on 200 feet of clay, so it's not going anywhere.
Not going down. No, it's really not.
Where we lose our nitrogen, it goes up. So if we have conditions where soils are saturated in the spring and it's already 25 to 30 degrees Celsius for daytime highs, we've seen that where we've lost probably, like you said, 50% of our nitrogen. But typically our water snow melt thaws early enough, and then by the time the fields do thaw out, we're in good shape. We don't seem to lose a whole lot of nitrogen, or else we wouldn't be doing that practice anymore.
Yep, for sure. And that is, everyone, the tale of both sides of the Canadian Shield. Amen. Okay. So go ahead, Pete.
Well, no. So it really does depend. If you put the nitrogen on right at freeze up, and it stays cold all the way till it thaws out, and then it thaws out and doesn't come in wet, then your losses are probably pretty minimal. You'd worry a little bit about the nitrous oxide emissions, because with all that nitrate pool that could be there in the spring, that's often that transformation. That's as the soil thaws out, that's when we get that big boost of nitrous oxide that we don't want from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. But other than that, your losses probably aren't all that bad. The challenge is when you get like last year, not this spring, but a year ago, man, I think you guys had a really wet spring, and I think you lost a ton of nitrogen. And then you just say, well, man, like, why'd I, like, isn't there a better way? And the challenge is to figure out what that better way is.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're starting
Absolutely.
to play with that. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brunel.
I was just going to say we're starting to play with like additives to the anhydrous, and like you mentioned, how you apply it, when you apply it. Typically in the fall here, we're doing anhydrous, so we're putting it down, what they consider deep banding, a good 3 to 4 inches deep minimum. I'd be more worried about shallow applied nitrogen.
That's deep here, Pete. Okay. Yeah. That's deep here. You're closing the slot, carrying on. Drive on, as Pete says.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But the time of year that you're applying it, and
if we applied anhydrous 4 inches deep, she'd all be in the air. Like, it just wouldn't. Like 28% we could do 4 inches deep. Anhydrous, if we're not 6 to 8, it just all gases off. Anyway, just it's a difference in areas, and clearly that's not happening to you, Brunel, or you would be putting it deeper.
For sure.
Yeah.
But we've got heavy gumbo soils, and we hold a lot of moisture, and it really tends to trap that nitrogen very well.
Mm-hmm. Hygroscopic, is that what it's called? Hydroscopic? And the anhydrous just immediately goes to the water and is there. Someone tell me what the term is. But also, Pete, Brunel has a little something called organic matter that Ontario doesn't know about. And so I'm just going to put that out there. There's some beauty soils that close up quite nicely. So now, okay, so Warren has entered the chat and suddenly wants to talk about sulfur, which I'm going to tell him that's not a bad idea, but we're going to get to that after our first clip. So because one of the sort of title for tonight is When Wheat Needs N. And part of that was sort of somewhat inspired by this interview that Kelvin did with Dave Ives from Ents Brothers. Yes. So if we could go to the clip there, producer Jay, and then we'll get back to this conversation in just a moment.
Dave, you and your team have, over the last several years, been looking at nitrogen mineralization, a study. I know, first of all, it's neat to see an equipment dealer doing this type of research. Can you fill us in on this project and what you're looking at?
Yeah, sure. It's been going on for 4 years. The study's been in wheat only, and it's spread across the province, right from the west side through the central part and into the east side. So we're trying to understand the whole nitrogen uptake and mineralization process in wheat and throughout the growing season. So essentially we're taking soil samples every 2 weeks throughout the growing season just to track the nitrogen uptake and use rates. And then in the fall we're determining when the mineralization is taking place and kind of what's needed for it to happen.
Okay. Any early observations? I know the study isn't complete, but you have 4 years of data.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the biggest surprise to me is the strong nitrogen uptake once the wheat is in, the 4 or 5 leaf stage. And we always hear about it, but it's really surprising to track it and to see the results. It's more than I had expected. And being an agronomist for 26 years, didn't realize that it needed that much N that quick. So yeah, it's been some interesting results for sure.
What are the implications of that spike on the chart when you look at the timeline of the growing season?
Yeah, well, I guess the biggest risk is not having enough N during that time period when the N demand is so significant. So I think we have to be aware of the products that we're using when we apply to ensure that we're not sacrificing any yield early on in the season.
Our sponsors for The Agronomists are ADAMA Canada, RealAg Radio, and the Wheat School. From varietal advancements, protein and yield management, precision farming, and marketing, RealAgriculture's Wheat School is a video series that tackles every facet of the wheat growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Wheat School is made possible through Syngenta Canada, C&M Seeds, and Alberta Grains. Learn more at wheatschool.com. I'm always dancing. All right. Love the tune. Okay. So just a quick reminder to everybody. Yes, tonight's discussion does qualify for as a knowledge sharing event. And a little later in the program, we'll be giving you an email so that you can zip an email and make sure you've got confirmation that you took in this KSE as it is called. Okay. So interesting discussion. And if you want to see the whole discussion with Dave, you can go to realagriculture.com. But really talking about how early wheat needs N, and are we shorting it? So Peter, I want to start with you. You have perhaps a different opinion of some of the discussion. Why is that?
So you always have to be really careful when you start taking soil nitrates and the crop is into its rapid uptake phase. And this is pretty well documented. We've seen it in the corn crop. And one of the reasons that we always do the pre-sidrate nitrate test on corn at about the, 5 leaf stage, right before it hits that rapid uptake stage, is that once it hits that, the nitrate levels essentially go to zero. So Shane and I just finished the nutrient uptake and partitioning study. And in that study, we pulled soil nitrates throughout the growing season. And what happened, 165 pounds of nitrogen, 65 pounds of nitrogen, like that was our 2 nitrogen rate treatments. And once we hit start at the rapid growth phase, growth stage 30, massive differences in soil nitrogen between those two treatments. And then every time we took a soil nitrate, they came closer and closer and closer together. And by the time we got to about anthesis, or certainly by the time we got to milk stage, they were exactly the same. And so the plant is taking so much up that the soil nitrates drop. And it's not necessarily an indication of available nitrogen. You'd wonder how it couldn't be, but you just have to take those with a grain of salt. I totally agree with what Dave said in terms of that rapid uptake, but tracking soil nitrates may not be the best way to actually sort out what that available nitrogen is.
So Brunel, when you're scouting and you're working with clients on, you've mentioned already having that base amount of N on in the fall because you may not be able to get in there to top dress and you wouldn't want to short that crop early. Do you worry with spring applied applications if you've used an inhibitor or something like that might slow down N availability? Do you worry about that if there isn't enough moisture?
I guess I'll give the same answer most agronomists are their favorite answer. It depends.
No, that's a politician, Brunel. Come on, that's a politician.
It depends. Look, we got it depends. Our check mark. Okay. We made it. Only halfway through. Okay. Great job, Brunel.
Generally, we don't, because if we have 70 or 80% of our nitrogen needs up front, it's not like it needs it as soon as the plant starts stretching out. It's going to need it at some point while it's elongating for sure. So as long as we've got a good base on there, then I'm not as worried. If I only have 50 or 60 pounds ahead of time, because that's what was on the soil test, or we didn't have a fall season where we could apply it, or they're going to top dress nitrogen or UAN after seeding for logistic reasons, then I'd be more concerned if we only got half of our N at that point, because we still have to apply it. We still need a rain to wash it into the roots. So I'm more worried about it on that end. I think we usually have enough soil moisture, enough organic matter that nitrogen becomes available in rapid order, or it'll probably go find somewhere.
So Brunel,
go ahead.
So just, are there many growers that you work with that would pull the anhydrous tank behind the seeder and put the anhydrous, mid-band the anhydrous between the 10 or 12-inch rows, so that we know we have it in the ground in the spring before the plant comes up and we're not at that risk of loss? Like, that to me is, I know it slows down the seeding process maybe, but that would sort of get around a lot of the issues that we're worried about.
Mm-hmm. If I looked across our producers that we work with, probably about 25-30% would be spring applied mid-row banding or side banding nitrogen, and
Mm-hmm.
more and more all the time. But then it all depends on what the spring conditions are. And a lot of the growers in the valley have replaced their previous air drill with a disc drill now, and they've got planters. So we've got tools coming out to no end to be able to put the crop in the ground depending on what the conditions are. And sometimes we only have that 1 week window. So
Mm-hmm.
we've had European farmers come and visit farms out here, and they just couldn't believe the amount of iron that the farmers out here have. But 10-15 years ago, we had some farms had the capability of putting in over 1,000 acres a day between different pieces of equipment, and like it's just phenomenal. And that's a 5 or 6,000 acre farm. Now I'm not talking a 10 or 12,000 acre farm here.
Yeah.
Our big farms are 5,000-6,000 acres in this area. So we've got the tools that we can adapt to whatever the situation is.
And Pete, you're worried about people taking 2 months to get the wheat crop in. September to November, baby. Come on. Yeah. That spring crop goes in 6 days, Pete. 6
I like
days. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let's contrast this a bit though, and then we do have some graphs that you've got some really neat stuff, Pete, that I want to look at too. But when we talk about the winter wheat crop, of course, there's always on the word. If anybody listens to Wheat Pete's Word on Wednesdays, there's always in like very tail end of winter, there's always a few hot to trot that are like, I'm going to put the N on the snow and we're going to get it on in there. And Pete has to have the discussion. No, it's too soon. But then there is such a thing as too late. So walk us through that decision on the winter wheat crop, because you do need that N on early, but there is such a thing as too early.
Yeah, so if you're putting nitrogen on snow, it's all bad because you have no clue where that. And by the way, Lyndsey, no manure on snow. Like how many times do we have
That
to
either.
Yeah.
No.
Gosh. No. So and then planting date. I mean, if you want to pull up slide 1, Lyndsey, the timing of your first nitrogen application on winter wheat really does depend on what your winter wheat looks like in the spring. And so here's 2 perfect examples. November 10th seeded wheat. This is the spring. You look at that and you know that you have to help that crop tiller as much as possible and hold every tiller that it makes, because it just doesn't have enough stems, enough potential heads per square foot. So that crop, mid-March on the frost, after the snow is gone, once the frost has come out, so it's not frozen soil, it's just we get that cold night maple syrup season. Yeah, I want to be out there and put on 50 pounds of nitrogen, maybe put my sulfur with it. 30 pounds is an absolute minimum. 50 is probably better. And just to hold that crop till I get the bigger shot when we really need it at the beginning of stem elongation. September 10th seeded, look at that crop. That crop doesn't need early nitrogen. Man, as long as it gets that nitrogen there kind of late April, before we hit the rapid growth phase, just let it be. You just, it's not nearly as critical. If you want to put the ammonium sulfate on early on the September 10th crop and put 80 to 100 pounds, so we're talking 16 to 20 pounds of nitrogen, sure, it's not going to hurt it, but you don't need to be there early. It's sort of one of those things where my really aggressive growers, they want to get out there early to hold that canopy and to if you can get the wheat going and keep it going all the way through, that's when you win the yen.
That's the Yield Enhancement Network, everyone. That's what yen stands for. All right, so Warren did ask, and you did mention it, is first pass event still the best time for all the sulfur, or should you keep a little back for a little later? What's the call on sulfur there, Pete?
Yeah, and so sulfur, again, we just finished the nutrient uptake. The sulfur demand on winter wheat in the province of Ontario is early. And so 90% of the sulfur is in the wheat crop by anthesis. So that means only 10% of the sulfur goes in after anthesis. And it's a fairly steep line, you definitely don't. The only time I see sulfur deficiency, I almost never see sulfur deficiency at flag leaf. If I'm going to see sulfur deficiency, I see it at growth state, first node, second node, early in the going. And so the bulk of the sulfur needs to be on early. We didn't do the study where we looked at split sulfur, so I can't say that we wouldn't get a little better sulfur efficiency or utilization if we did save the last little bit for the second nitrogen application. But we're going to put the 3/4, 80%, 90% of the sulfur on up front, or all of it, because there's really no reason that you would lose sulfur. So very little sulfur in the second application, if any at all.
So, and I guess that is always a consideration. Is it really at risk of being lost? Because if it's not, then what's the risk of going 100% early on? Really?
Yeah, and with sulfur, you will lose all the nitrogen before you lose any of the sulfur. The only real risk with sulfur is if the biology ties it up. If there's a lot of residue there and they're tying nitrogen up, they might tie some of that sulfur up as well. But realistically, the risk of loss on sulfur is really, really limited.
So, Brunel, you're of course in an area that loves to grow canola wheat. No, Brunel says, I know you're not. I'm just kidding.
Not even that.
But there is canola in the rotation. Canola is a big sulfur user. So for your wheat growers, where are they putting their sulfur in rotation?
One of the things that we're noticing is a lot of the multi-product, like something like the microessential products that have phosphate, sulfur. The sulfur typically is half ammonium sulfate, half elemental. We're moving a lot of growers into using that product through their rotation. There's a lot of different iterations available. A lot of fertilizer retails like that idea because they can carry one or two products, and it's kind of got a bit of everything. But because we can't put everything down with the canola to grow a 60 bushel canola crop, we can't get all of our sulfur needs down, where a lot of guys are starting to use these kinds of products through their rotation. So after 3, 4, 5 years, like even though half of it is elemental, you've always got that constant supply releasing, and we're being able to meet our sulfur needs across the rotation that way. That's been a big game changer for us, I think, because we are finally starting to see some sulfur deficiencies show up on some of our eroded knolls as we grow these big bushel crops, and as genetics get better and we keep pushing yields. So I think it's looking at it across the rotation and starting to apply it in your wheat and your head of corn, everything.
Yep.
Yeah. We would have a little
canola
more
does
trouble.
not love sulfur in the row. Let's just put that out there. Canola,
but it loves sulfur.
Yeah,
it
loves
love
sulfur, just not so close to the seeds. Yeah, go ahead, Pete. Yeah,
I was just going to say it's a bit tougher for us to build soil sulfur reserves just because we get full moisture charge over the winter, and Brunel has heavy clay. He doesn't get leaching. Here in Ontario, we can get leaching of that sulfur out. So it's not impossible to build those soil sulfur reserves, but it's not quite as simple as it is in Western Canada.
We've been doing a lot of work with those kinds of products too, and because of our heavy clay soils and how wet we're at seeding time, it seems like some of the rules of seed burn and how much fertilizer we can safely put down in the seed, like we're intentionally working it in there that we get an extra bag of canola seed because we want to see how far we can push for burn. And the only time we've seen a reduction in plant stand was when we forgot to shut both tanks off. So we were putting down 2x products, and even then we cut our populations in half, but at the end of the day, the yield was the same. So
canola is very elastic.
If we have any little bit of moisture, we can
push it.
Tend to get away with things that we can't in other geographies in Western Canada where they don't get these rains.
And again, organic matter and clay that holds water.
Yeah.
If everybody had a spring flood, it would be, be great. Everybody could just manage everything the same. Doesn't work that way, people. Okay, so we are working our way through. This is just flying by. So, producer Jay, if you could run our last thank you of the night to our show sponsors, and then after that, I'm going to share the email address for our knowledge sharing event, and then we've got some really great, some cool slides and some great questions from Dr. Dave Hooker to go through as well. So, Jay, if you could. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are ADAMA Canada, the Wheat School, and RealAg Radio. Real Agriculture's RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily 1-hour agricultural radio show broadcast across North America on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. Hosted by ag expert Sean Haney, the show airs weekdays at 4:30 Eastern across Canada and the U.S. and is rebroadcast at 7 a.m. the next day. Listen live on Rural Radio 147 or check it out on realagriculture.com/radio or download as a podcast. I'm going to dance every time. That's all there is to it. Okay. All right. So we do have some neat slides I want to go through, Pete, that you shared, and this plays into Dave's question here of the percent of total N taken up before growth stage 31, before flag, after flowering. So we're going to look into some of that now. So Pete, which slide do you want to start on?
So why don't we go to slide 6? That will answer Dave's question the best.
Okay. Dun, da, da, da. All right. Walk us through it.
So this is the nitrogen uptake, and this is at the 165-pound nitrogen rate, and it's on soft red winter wheat, okay? And essentially, Dave, he asked great questions, as always. We didn't really sample very much in the fall or before growth stage 30, and so when you look at this chart, you'd say, well, it looks like about 35 pounds or somewhere a little over 25% of that nitrogen is actually already in the crop by the time we get to growth stage 30. And that number surprised me. I didn't expect it to be that high. Where it's coming from, we get some uptake in the fall. We did do one fall where we took a few samples in the fall. You plant early, you get a nice little bit of nitrogen in the crop in the fall. But, by the time we hit the 25th of April in here in Ontario, depends of course where in Ontario, but something like that, there's been that much uptake into that crop. And then after that, you can see that the increase, and maybe Jay, if we could just go then to probably slide 4, and it will show us it's the same graph, but it just takes the lines off. And so this is the nitrogen uptake on that soft red wheat, and look at the slope of the line from stem elongation, growth stage 30, right up until flag leaf stage. And so we get 71% of the nitrogen is in that crop by the time we get to flag leaf stage. On average, 2 3/4, 2.75 pounds per acre per day of uptake between growth stage 30 and 32. And in the crop that took up the most rapidly, it was up to 4 pounds per acre per day of nitrogen that we were putting into that crop. So that early uptake, and I mean, Dave talked about that in his work on the spring wheat in Western Canada. So even though that was soil nitrates, which I kind of question a bit, I think the concept is bang on. You cannot short the crop in that early stage. And by flag leaf, you have 30% left. By anthesis, we have 14% left of the nitrogen to go in the crop. Contrast that with corn, where with corn, we still have 38% of the nitrogen to go in the crop after tassel. So it just shows you wheat's a short season crop. It's powering it all in, and we need the big shot on basically by, growth stage 30, 31 at the latest. And if we're going to put anything on flag leaf or later, it's the small shot. And I think that really does, as Dave says, it really does help inform better when to time those nitrogen applications.
Now, Jason Vogt out of Manitoba, Brunel's neighbor, just about. Everybody is kind of. Great question. And actually, we have a slide that relates to Amy's work. So what is the nitrogen per bushel number that both are using? Amy's done some great work on N uptake in wheat in Manitoba, and Brunel has done some as well. So what that number is. So we do, what slide is that, Pete, where we've got some of Amy's work?
So Amy's work is on slide 3. I'm not sure it'll answer the question. So this is Amy's work on split nitrogen, right? Okay. And just showing that in Manitoba they got higher yields when they split the nitrogen. I believe it was 50% at seeding and 50% at stem elongation. Don't quote me on the 50-50, but I'm pretty sure that's correct, versus putting it all on at planting. And if at the flag leaf stage, when they did that 50-50, then they were, statistically no difference, but numerically a little bit less yield, which makes perfect sense. If I have 70% of the nitrogen in the crop, I don't want to save half of it to flag leaf stage.
Right.
And interestingly enough, in Amy's work, it didn't much matter whether she had 110 pounds or 140 pounds on. If she split the nitrogen, the crop used most of that nitrogen. In our own work here in Ontario, by the way, Lyndsey, really interesting that we put on 165 pounds of nitrogen. The soft wheat picked up 145. The hard wheat picked up 160. And so we really the nitrogen use efficiency was really excellent in those trials, much better than what we might have thought. So Brunel, you need to answer Jason's question. I've yattered on about Amy's work, but I have no clue about your work.
Well, a lot of the work that we had done earlier was actually part of this work with John Hurd and Amy Magin. It was a kind of a collaborative effort between producers, agronomists, the university. Amy was doing her PhD, her master's and her PhD, probably doing work on nitrogen and wheat. And then so we had everything from small plot, and then we tried the same and replicated field scale stuff. So it was a really intensive effort. And I think, if I remember correctly from what John Hurd had, when I first started my career, we were probably using a number around 2.75 pounds per bushel of wheat. But then following John's work, the first year, we kind of dialed that back. Okay, we've got better varieties that are higher yielding, more efficient at using nitrogen. It was a pound or 2 to 2.1, I think. But following Amy's other work, they finally settled on a number of about 2.25 pounds per nitrogen. So that's what we're kind of aiming, anywhere from 2 to 2.25. It'll depend on the kind of wheat that we're growing. It'll depend on a slew of other factors. You adjust from there depending on what the previous crop was, what the moisture outlook is, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
But that would be around where I would start.
So Dave, did you, in some of that work that you did, Brunel, did you do a zero rate trial, or in the trial, was there a zero?
No, I don't think we were doing any, not on the field scale stuff that we were doing. Amy might have done some in the small plot stuff.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, finish up, Brunel. Finish up.
Well, I was just going to say, because we're, like Lyndsey mentioned, we're high organic matter, heavy clay, lots of moisture. The nitrogen pipeline to me is a leaky one. There's all sorts of ins and outs to the system. And the more we try to figure it out, the more we realize, everything is so driven by water and, as in terms of how much is going to be available during the year, how much we're going to lose. We run a lot of agronomy benchmarking with our growers. So just based on paper, how much nitrogen did we start on the soil test? How much did we add? What was the yield? Trying to look at nitrogen efficiencies and stuff. And there's a lot of unknowns along with the knowns. It's the more we, like I said, the more we try to figure it out, the more questions we have. And that's part of the fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that almost all through Western Canada, the Western U.S., North Dakota, South Dakota, even through Montana, they're all at kind of somewhere between 2.25 and 3.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, and yet a bushel of wheat at 14% only takes out 1.4 pounds. And so you're putting on 2.25, you're always putting on significantly more nitrogen than you're removing in the grain of that crop. And you kind of go, from a nitrogen balance standpoint, where's all the rest of that nitrogen going? Are we actually building organic matter, or how does that fit together? But it is a really intriguing thought process why we need that much nitrogen. We certainly don't go anywhere close to that here once you hit Eastern Canada, Eastern US seaboard. No, we would be closer to maybe 1.1 pounds per bushel of wheat. And by the way, our wheat's 9%, so we're only taking out 0.9 pounds per bushel. So we're still at more nitrogen than we're taking out of the field, but hopefully it's getting tied up in the straw.
Yeah, so the ratio is a bit different. And that is a good point. When we're having this discussion between them, Western Canada grows some very high protein wheat, and we know that protein is nitrogen related, of course, uses a lot of it, and so that is going to make a big difference between 9% wheat and 13.5% protein. That's a lot of nitrogen difference, right? So there is that as well. A question from Jim that we're going to get to in a moment, but Pete, walk me through, because there's some interesting stuff in here. I think it's slide 7. Jay, if you could bring out slide 7 from Pete.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, this is a cool slide. So I want to make sure we get this in there before we run out of room. And don't let me forget to share Margaret's email in a minute. But what are we looking at? What is this big yellow hump?
Okay, so this is from Dr. Romulo Loletto from Kansas State University, and it is on winter wheat, but Kansas is dry, just like Western Canada, and I highly doubt that you'd see much difference in the response of spring wheat versus winter wheat. And so look at those two graphs. The graph that you're looking at on the left-hand side, the low peak, that is 100% fall nitrogen. And Kansas is a dry climate. They are not losing it like Brunel would be in the Red River Valley of Manitoba. They're dry. Look at the difference on the right-hand side, where they do 40% of the nitrogen applied in the fall, 50% in the spring at green up or shortly after, and 10% right at anthesis. The same nitrogen rate applied in both cases. The uptake in the crop is only 90 pounds or 70 pounds, I guess 70 pounds, where we put it all on in the fall, and I'm at 120 pounds where I put it all on, or where I split apply rather. So the difference in nitrogen use efficiency by split applying nitrogen is just way cool. And Dave, you're right. What really is interesting as well is that in our work, 86% of the nitrogen taken up by anthesis. In Romulo's work, 84% taken up by anthesis, and it's the same 84% whether it's all fall applied or whether we split apply. So the percentage of nitrogen in the crop doesn't look like it's affected by when I apply it, unless of course I put it on after anthesis. That might change that a little.
Yeah.
But regardless, let's say 85% of the nitrogen in the crop by anthesis, really, really cool.
It is interesting to see how significantly different that line can look. And as Dave points out too, as you look at that blue and those green that they dip, showing that the majority of
remobilization,
yes, and that it remobilized into the grain. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I'm learning. We think about that in corn, right? We think about corn just taking everything out of the stalk and putting it into that kernel, and then you get corn that falls over. But certainly we're seeing it here in wheat as well, where we're seeing it remobilized from the stem and the leaves, which is really cool. Okay, so Jim has a question, and I like this. I like how he phrases this. Why are some leading growers like Sean Schill, Shaw Ridge Farms, getting great results from applying, I think he means Amadeus, but it's with an A, not an O, at soft dough stage, saying that Sean got 154 bushels per acre on witch wheat a few years ago. So soft dough stage, it's pretty late. Pete, what do you think is going on there?
I did that interview with Sean, and I don't believe it was at the soft dough stage. I believe that was a flag leaf application or a boot stage application. And so we still have that 20% left. And Jim, I'll have to go back and rewatch that, or we can Twitter Sean and ask him. But I don't think it was that late, and it was a hard wheat, and he was looking for protein. And Sean is an excellent grower. He's we're really pushing hard when you talk to Sean, and he's always going to have lots of nitrogen there. So if you look at the percentage of his nitrogen that he puts on in that third application, it's still a pretty small portion. I think he had maybe 140 on before he put that last 30 pounds on, or 40 pounds of nitrogen on. So he still has the majority of that nitrogen on early like he needs to. And then he's just trying to keep that grain crop, that wheat crop, flat out and making as big a yield as possible.
Right. Okay. We'll have to find that video. Now, Brunel, similar question, but maybe more general, but when you think about your top wheat growers that you're working with, do they all top dress, would you say? Are they all going in and chasing that protein later, or no?
No, not at all. Not necessarily. I don't know if I would have the numbers of who does and who doesn't. Like some guys will put all of their N up front and still go top dress if conditions. Like if we get a nice early spring, we get the wheat planted early, it's up quick, and we get weather in those high teens for the first month and a half or so, where it's going to take its time. It's going to tiller like crazy. It's going to make nice big heads. We may go in and say we'll readjust then, and we'll look at maybe top dressing an extra 10 gallons of UAN or something in between the acts, just because we think that potential is there.
Yeah.
Conversely, if it's a really dry year where a lot of people are going to, even looking at protein as another management factor that we play with N rates to adjust our protein levels, depending on, do we think we're going to surpass the yield goals that we had and will be a low protein crop? As if everybody has a low protein crop, then higher protein wheat can pay. Or if we don't think we're going to meet the minimum and we want to avoid discounts, we'll play with our nitrogen that way too. Right. And that's a whole other ball game, I think, to today's conversation.
Yes, that is its own show. It's called the Protein Wars, and we're going to do it this winter, Brunel. You're coming back, and we're going to have the Protein Wars. Anyway, but it is, and you bring up a good point, Brunel, of course, is yes, making sure you're meeting that minimum standard, but also if it is looking like it's going to be a low protein year, you can really get some fantastic premiums for some bumped up protein. So if the potential is there and you can manage for it, then why the heck wouldn't you? That's what I say. Okay. So we are rapidly running out of time. So if anybody's got any last questions, please pop them in the chat. Kara has been Googling around and has found the interview with Sean Schill and has put that link in the chat. So I think that's on Kara, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's on YouTube. Maybe she'll put it on Facebook as well. But it is from 2017, if you can believe it. Dr. Dave Hooker says he has juicy questions for the two of you. I am going to hang on before I ask Dave's question. We're going to share the email. So tonight for the knowledge sharing event, if you have an off-calf project and you need to attend a knowledge sharing event, that's this one. The email is may@ontariosoilcrop.org. There we go. So May, that's Margaret May. If you don't know, she's lovely. Tell her Lyndsey sent you. May@ontariosoilcrop.org. Okay, we'll put that up again once more at the end of the show. But write that down, copy paste, whatever you're gonna do. Let us know. Okay, juicy question time. Dave, you're my favorite for using this term. Okay, what do you think about multiple foliar applications of N for meeting 100% wheat demand? Whoa. With a small amount of total N. We're going foliar. We're feeding the leaves. Come on. All right, Pete. This is apparently a hot topic on Twitter, which apparently, Dave, it's called X. So get with the times. Okay. I don't know. I don't call it X. Nobody's calling it X, Elon. Just get over yourself. It's still Twitter. Okay. So what do we think? Multiple foliar applications. How much diesel fuel are we willing to spend? I don't know. Pete? Thumbs up, thumbs down for this idea.
Oh, is that? Oh.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. We haven't done thumbs up, thumbs down in so long. I'm bringing it back right now. Okay. Thumbs down. Why? Why?
So we talked about how much nitrogen is in the crop, right? And so it's pretty simple. 13% wheat is 1.3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. 10% is 1 pound of nitrogen. Like, you can do that math really simply. And if you're going to get 100 bushels of wheat at 13%, you need 130 pounds of nitrogen in the grain. You simply can't do that foliar. It's got to come out of the soil. Leaves are not designed to take up nitrogen. Roots are designed to take up nitrogen. If you try to put that much nitrogen on the leaf, you will just burn it off. You can do little bits, but are you going to do 2 pounds 50 times? Like it doesn't make sense. And so somehow we're pulling it out of the soil, and that's okay if I have the soil nitrogen reserves, but try to do that on a sand soil with low organic matter and lots of rainfall. Have a nice day. Not a chance. Never going to happen.
So, Brunel, question: why do you think we want to go foliar? Why would somebody be like, I'll just spray it on"? Like, really? What do you think the thought process is there?
Well, the idea is that it's more efficient. You're spoon feeding the crop. What I've always been told is exactly what Peter has said. It's you can't put enough nitrogen in the plant that way. It's not efficient enough to do it. I think that a lot of people that are anecdotally saying, "Oh, so and so's tried it, it works, whatever, whatever." I mentioned before the nitrogen is a leaky pipeline. There is all sorts like organic. I think we're the guys that are doing it and still maintaining yields might be able to get away with it for a couple of years because they have that organic matter, because they have the soil has such a tremendous power to supply nitrogen that the guy, I don't know that it's been properly evaluated in whether it be a university or a proper research setting. There's so many ins and outs. The more like going back to the benchmarking program that I said, in the last year, the group average as a whole had pounds of nitrogen that it took to produce 1 bushel. So that's how much nitrogen on paper went into the plant. Was the average for the group was 2.3. The average for my top 10 producers was 1.5. So those are very interesting numbers, but I mean, we're not measuring mineralization. We're not measuring denitrification. Right. We don't have the means to accurately assess that across the field that can be so different 10 feet away, never mind a half a mile. So I think a lot of the people they're looking at these products and say, hey, I did this last year and it worked just fine. You're working on borrowed time in a sense, because when you look at something like phosphate at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Peter Entz had some zero phosphate trials, and he says it took 15 years to tap out the soil of phosphate. But then when the yields fell, he said it fell off a cliff.
Yeah.
Like it maintained it for 15 years and then it just crashed. And there's no
that's what your soil had. Your soil had 15 years of reserves and then they were gone. You can't.
John Hurd's done a bit of that on nitrogen, Lyndsey, and he said it depends on the soil, exactly what Brunel said, but 3 years in some soils, like the first 3 years, no nitrogen, and you look like a winner. And then you deplete that nitrate reserve in the soil, and the wheels fall off. And man, Dr. Dave just is putting the final touches on our long-term P&K study. And man, that's exactly what Brunel talked about as well. If you don't apply phosphorus and you have low soil test, you can get 50 bushel corn on fields that would otherwise yield 200 bushel corn. So come on. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Have a nice day.
Yeah. And Dave, I will apologize. You did ask a great question earlier about having sufficient P&K to make use of that. And again, whole other show. Come on back for it. Let's plan it for like January. If only because we're already over time and I'm going to get the old cane across the neck here pretty soon. So there you go. Fascinating discussion. And also, Ray, I'm glad to see you. I didn't think you were here and I was wondering where you might be. So Ray DeBanco did eventually make it in there. And he was talking about the consideration, of course, of custom versus doing your own work and what fuel costs. And that all has to work into the equation as well. Absolutely. Okay. So as you can see on your screen, let Margaret know that you've taken in tonight's show and get that KSE credit. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. You can let us know in the there's a little form to fill out online that you watch the show. You can get your CEU credits that way. And you can also subscribe to the email that will tell you what topics are coming up and send you the link and remind you. Just a quick reminder, we're no show next week, but we'll be back September 11th. Brunel, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to talk again this week, actually. That's a little teaser for everybody that watches or listens to the radio show. Brunel's going to be on the radio show later this week. So thank you. And Pete, you had to be here, but we thank you anyway.
Well, thanks for having me, Lyndsey. Even if I had to be here, I had a blast. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I do appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge with our audience. And I am joking. You can say no at any time, but then I will be mad at you. So there you go. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you to our show sponsors as well. Of course, ADAMA Canada, RealAg Radio. And what was the last one? I can't even remember.
Weed
So there
School.
you go. Yeah, the Weed School. How could I forget? Go to weedschool.com, everybody. All right. Have a great night. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.